Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Support the podcast. Become a paid subscriber on the Substack. I was just approved by Apple. So if you listen through Apple podcasts, you can subscribe for, I think, $4.99 a month or $49.99 annual. You get a 10% discount there if you want to listen ad-free on Apple. So that's going to support me. Or you can continue listening free with ads, or become a paid subscriber to listen without ads as well. All of that helps keep me going. Joining us for the first time is Paula Jardine, who's a contributor to Brownstone Institute and The Conservative Woman, both great publications. She also has a graduate diploma in law from ULaw, a history degree from the University of Toronto, and a journalism degree from the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She's got the credentials. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We chatted a few years back on TNT Radio, but this is your first time with me on my Geopolitics and Empire podcast. So you've been writing for some of these alternative outlets. Anything you want to add about your background, the work that you do?
Yeah. The lockdown in the UK is what sort of brought me back to being a journalist, because I'd had a gap of about 20 years and started writing the end of 2021. It was supposed to be a one-off, and it's kind of taken me off in this direction again. But it was concern over the vaccine program and the lockdowns and just the general direction of travel. And I just happened to have a skill set that was very useful in sort of understanding and analysing what was going on. Very concerning.
No, that's great that you were moved and inspired to throw your hat in the ring to become a woman in the arena, so to speak. I often take from Teddy Roosevelt's, becoming a man in the arena. And we need so many people to do this wherever they are and in whichever manner they can. And a lot of people, even some of my past guests, said, COVID was a cold slap in the face to them. And so you've been doing a lot of writing on principally those two websites the past, can we say now, almost half decade. And to get your big picture view, maybe to start, and then we can drill on down on some of the minutiae, the Robert Kadlecs, the Wellcome Trusts, the, what's his name, Farrar.
Jeremy Farrar.
Jeremy Farrar. But, you use different phrases like Biodefense Mafia, the biosecurity cabal. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think their plan was for COVID. And it didn't start with COVID, as you write about. We'll get to this, your recent article on how they did a dry run here in Mexico in 2009 with the fake swine flu pandemic. I'm trying to beat the AI on Pentagon tube. But and then, of course, you just told me, I was shocked, Robert Kadlec is about to be appointed a position. And you can just tell me about that real quick?
Yes, he had. There was a confirmation hearing yesterday with the Senate Armed Forces Committee, and he is the nominee as the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Chemical, Biological. The CYBERN, I think, is the acronym that they use. And of course, everybody's highly complimentary about him. And I happen to think that he's one of the main perpetrators of this war on microbes, is what I've been referring to it as, but it goes back in planning to about 2015. And the origins are much earlier than that. And they go back to Kadlec's time as the Director of Biodefense Policy under George W. Bush, because he is the person who's written all 21st century American biodefense policy. And now he's going to be in a more powerful position, and I suspect the agenda is to help him kind of counter some of what RFK Jr. is doing at HHS. So,
and all of, yeah, go ahead.
It's a nefarious insertion into back into the system, because he's a very capable political operative. That's very clear.
This is not good for us. Dick Cheney is interesting. The timing. Dick Cheney at age 84 just left this plane, and unless he repented, he's probably not in a good place right now. And then you mentioned to me as well the project for a new American century, that you feel like that this is related to what's going on as well. And I do not doubt it. And so maybe just to start, what do you think? Go as far back as you want, but what is their game here? What are their master designs for humanity through biodefense and biosecurity?
Well, I think there were two. So what people perhaps don't know but should know about Kadlec is that he was one of the weapons inspectors sent to Iraq during the 1990s. He and a friend named William Patrick, who was the main US bioweapons researcher working on anthrax back in the 50s and 60s. And he had some patents which happened to have been converted over into vaccines. And of course, under the Bayh-Dole Act, American government scientists have a nice, tidy pension scheme, or supplemental pension scheme if they manage to get their patents commercialized. So that was part of where the biodefense angle on this started in the late 90s and post 9/11 era. But I think it also has a link into the PNAC defense plans, which called for full spectrum dominance. And although the main document that was written by PNAC, that was the basis of the post 9/11 military doctrine, there's a passing mention in it to genetic weapons, which I think ties into what they're doing with the mRNA and the other genetic vaccines. But the plans originate from there, because as part of that, they also wanted to have digital fingerprints so that they could identify threats in cyberspace. And I think that the two have become melded together since the early 2000s.
I just want to jump in here real quick. So, I mean, effectively, I think a lot of us can see what you just outlined. You put together all of the science fiction movies, and I mean, as you said, full spectrum dominance. So it's putting together biologics, DNA, surveillance, digitalization. I mean, basically total control of humanity. Yep. And recently I had on Bruce Gagnon, where we talked about full spectrum dominance in this, more specifically on this, on the sense of space, which is one arena. You focus on another, which is the biological dimension. And Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, right, part of the whole Trump MAGA movement, by extension, just signed a law of genetic verification law, where I think all people born in El Salvador or something to that end will have their DNA taken or scanned, which is
interesting, because I remember even before COVID, there were signs in the airport at Heathrow. I think it was HSBC Bank was had some advertising material, and it said, "In the future, your DNA will be your fingerprint." That's been making the rounds as well on alternative media, on the socials as well. People repost that. Spiros Kouras recently, that's the last place I saw it a few weeks ago, reposted that DNA print. And we can see, well, we'll get to that later. I want to get your thoughts on that. But if you want to just continue with, and I forgot to mention as well, if people haven't listened to this, a few years back, I interviewed Igor Shepard on the podcast. He doesn't do interviews anymore. So he's a Russian American. He was originally a Russian scientist, but he's worked in the US military industrial complex. And he gave me a powerful interview that was taken off of, I think, Pentagon Tube, where he was talking about all of this stuff and the genetic manipulation. And he was also saying that behind the scenes, a lot of the supposed adversarial countries are actually working together on some of this stuff, like China and the US and Russia, that some of their defense establishments have communication with each other. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyways, if you want to continue telling us about the biodefense mafia and their agenda. Yeah. So back in the post 9/11 era, Kadlec was director of Biodefense Policy in the Bush administration, Bush Jr. And some of the other people that have been very prominent in the last 5 years through COVID as part of the kind of international leadership pushing the vaccine agenda, worked with him. So there were a lot of people that were surrounding him who had very prominent roles in 2020. So Richard Hatchett would be one. So he started off running a project to organize medical support in the event of a biological event or a 9/11 type event, and then was Kadlec's successor as director of Biodefense Policy. He and the next biodefense, so his deputy at the time, who became his replacement, is somebody named Dr. James Lawler. And Dr. James Lawler is now at the Veterans Association, I think. But the two of them wrote the 2007 Pandemic Preparedness Plan for the US government. And of course, as the international health regulations were changed, so I think they negotiated that in about 2005, and they came into effect in 2007, and countries had to start monitoring respiratory disease and report to the WHO if there were incidents of unusual, not quite sure what an unusual pneumonia is myself. Apparently you can't tell unless it's got a genetic test. But this is kind of where it started. And as part of what Kadlec was doing, they had a program to stockpile things like anthrax vaccines and anthrax treatments, which, as I said, partly benefited his friend William Patrick, who held some of these patents. But they started to sort of involve the pharmaceutical industry more in their plan. So it's like, how can we expand this? What other, in the interests of full spectrum dominance, what else do we need to have vaccines available at short notice for? And there's another person who was very prominent in behind the scenes, he was working as a consultant for Kadlec. His name's Michael Callahan. So he was the program manager at DARPA. And in about 2007, he came up with a program that he called Inner Armor. And he wanted to give American soldiers an advantage on the battlefield as part of this doctrine of full spectrum dominance that extended to making these super soldiers, and it was strengthening the immune system. So you were going to have these rapid response genetic vaccines and be able to boost their immune system, so that if you were to send somebody into, say, the Congo, you weren't going to have soldiers falling sick from tropical diseases that the natives were immune to, and they weren't. And Kadlec and Law, in 2020, Callahan and Lawler were deployed by Kadlec to the Diamond Princess. And that was a training exercise that had been in progress for 2 years. It had been planned.
Wait, so this is that cruise ship, right? At the start of COVID that people got sick on. So they were deployed at that moment, or at the previous moment?
Well, what happened? So Callahan was actually in Wuhan, doing a study on avian influenza with Chinese hospitals in Wuhan. And Robert Malone said he got a call from him from China on the 4th of January. And in one of the books that was written about the development of the vaccines, he is reported to have escaped from Wuhan before the lockdown. So he was tipped off. And I think the reason he was tipped off is because Richard Hatchett is the person who asked the Chinese CDC, who was headed by Dr. George Gao, who's an old friend of Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust and now the WHO. I think they needed a favour from him. And that's how Callahan managed to get out of Wuhan before Wuhan was locked down. But the two of them, they had organised a training exercise with the Japanese government, and it had been 2 years in the planning. And Kadlec was interviewed, and he said, well, we just happened to already be having this training exercise planned with a cruise ship, and we were able to deploy earlier when we really needed to because there was a problem. And of course, that's where the idea of asymptomatic spread got legs, because there weren't very many people getting sick on the cruise ship until they decided to test everyone, and all of a sudden the virus was everywhere, even amongst people who weren't sick.
So I have a few questions there. Just on the simulations. So I just thought of this. A lot of us have heard of, you had the 2001 Dark Winter,
Yep.
right? And then since then,
which Kadlec was involved in.
Yeah, I remember years back, I actually read that document. And then you had, of course, later on, you had Event 201 in October 2019. A lot of people, and I got this from Whitney Webb when she posted at the time, in September of 2019, a month before Event 201, in Wuhan Airport, the Chinese ran a coronavirus simulation in Wuhan Airport in September of 2019. What are the chances? And there was a mainstream Chinese news article, which you could use in Google throw into Google Auto Translate, that would talk about that. You had Clade X, which you talk about in your writings. And then in the later years, I can remember some of the Urban Outbreak was another, Crimson Contagion. And then just the late Francis Boyle, who I've had on the podcast, he often talked about the anthrax attacks and how those were false flag operations to gin up fear for the Patriot Act and the implementation of the police state. So just any thoughts on some of these simulations? Well, and I didn't know about the Diamond Princess one. So it seems like they're, and I mean, just to offshoot, but you recently had this knife attack by Huntingdon in UK. And it's a hell of a coincidence that the UK authorities ran a simulation in March of exactly this scenario. But yeah,
it's amazing how many simulations seem to take place on the day of these big events. So even London, the 7/7 bombings, there just happened to be a simulation with that exact scenario on the same day. And the intelligence services are all over that. But it's very difficult to write about it because you're instantly finding yourself in the realms of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. The simulations that just happen to seem to pop up every time we have one of these events. I looked at the Boston bombing with another UK journalist, and that was the same.
I mean, even 9/11, I think back in the day, was it Webster Tarpley or someone who compiled a list of 40 to 50 events that took place on or just following up to 9/11, and that, I think that they were running so many simulations and drills on that day. And just, do you have any other bigger comment on the simulation? So effectively, they're constantly running these to plan what they're going to roll out, and so in some cases it's just to get on board, I guess, the different actors that they want: governments, government agencies, private institutions.
I mean, there are a number of agendas in the back of it. So one of it is that vaccines as a project, or a US military project, so something like 50% of all vaccines in current use have come from US military research or funded research.
You mean like the vaccines that they put on the CDC childhood schedule? Even
going back to measles and polio. So the original need for those vaccines was military preparedness, because during the First World War, they had measles outbreaks in boot camps, which was impairing operational effectiveness. So Merck, was it George Merck is his first name, but the founder of Merck Pharmaceuticals, it was a US military researcher. He's the person who developed the measles vaccine. And if you look at polio during North African campaign in the Second World War, the locals didn't get sick because polio is spread by contaminated water. So it's oral fecal. And the Americans noticed that the locals weren't getting sick and they were getting sick. Their soldiers were getting sick. So that's where the attempt to come up with a vaccine for that came from.
Maybe I can ask you, because you wrote, let me read this quote from one of your, this was about almost a year ago, your piece on war on microbes and the murky agenda behind COVID. And you say, quote, the biodefense mafia don't really care whether zoonosis, a disease passed from animals to humans, or a lab leak was to blame for SARS-CoV-2. They just want you to believe that there was a pandemic and restrict causation to one of those two options. It's a false binary. Either explanation is a win for them because what they're really doing is setting an elephant trap. The objective is to perpetuate the war on microbes, a taxpayer-subsidized pharma racket in which finding or inventing viruses in order preemptively to invent countermeasure vaccines can continue ad infinitum. Feel free to give your opinion. I kind of don't, people believe what they want. There's all these people who come in and say infectious disease contagion viruses don't exist. I kind of feel like, given all these projects that they're working on, you mentioned earlier, like this universal soldier type stuff, I take the position that's in the middle where, I think they have nuclear weapons that can cause mega death, but I don't believe that the radiation effect lasts so long, like so-called nuclear winter. So if it's like, it's a middle position. The nuclear winter scare theory is to create this massive fear-mongering that they want to use as the pretext to create world government. And so I see the same thing like with the climate change stuff. Okay, yeah, we destroy the environment in some ways, but the whole CO2 thing, it's all bunk. And again, the pretext for world government. And same thing with the health. I think that there is, at a lower level, infectious disease and contagion, but it's really not a big deal. We don't need injections. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, when you look at epidemics through history, look at Mexico, for instance, a lot of it has to do with food stress. So these events become mass death events because there's an environmental stress. There's usually a drought or some interruption in the food supply. And I think one of the, I can't pronounce the Mexican word. Yes. And they referred, there's a journal article, Mega Drought, Mega Death. And when somebody's gone back and actually reviewed the records, there was severe drought. And that was what was driving the illness. And it was a little bit like the hemorrhagic fevers. Because I spent quite a bit of time looking at Ebola, and I think they used mass vaccination campaigns of yellow fever to engineer these outbreaks. So when you go back to Ebola in the 1970s, the original outbreaks, the Africans didn't think there was anything unusual. It just looked like typhoid. And you get some of these same hemorrhagic side effects. And we've forgotten what that typhoid's like. we don't experience it. We've got proper sanitation, so we don't see it. So there is, I think, zoonosis is a bit of an excuse for explaining, mysterious things, and you want to dream up a new vaccine and an excuse to experiment on people under an emergency to roll it out.
Yeah, and my argument is like we don't even have to go to the controversial perspective, especially when you're trying to convince the general populace that that viruses don't exist, because whether it's, as you say, what they tell us, zoonosis or a lab leak, both of those, I would say, are bunk. They're lying through their teeth. All of these actors, that whatever they say, they are lying and creating always these fake pretexts to bring in this totalitarian project that they have. And just real quick, I want to ask you about any thoughts on Robert Malone. He's been controversial. I do have to say I have a lot of doubts about him as a strange sort of actor, having previously been steeped in this biodefense system, and then all of a sudden being some sort of, speaking out against it, but still kind of remaining in it. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I know it's become very polarized, and there are lots of fingers being pointed at various people saying that they're not genuine in their opposition to things. And I mean, I suppose there's some of that. I try and stay away from it, and I'm more trying to reconstruct the history of who's been moving this agenda forward. And although he was a research scientist heavily involved in this area, I don't see him as a political actor in this. And I'm more interested in who the political actors are and what the big agenda coming behind it is. Because if you look at zoonosis, for instance, some of that links back to the Rockefeller Foundation and their One Health agenda. And a lot of that is about expanding the market for pharmaceuticals. So I think what they're doing now is trying to create an additional market for these vaccine companies by requiring farmyard animals be vaccinated for multiple things. And it's just not necessary. It endangers our food supply.
Because I was going to bring that up, because you had an article on chikungunya.
Chikungunya,
another useless money spinner, every day, every week now, you find articles. Here's a suggestion. There's a biodefense. I don't have it at hand, but I subscribe to this newsletter on biodefense, which compiles the latest news on biodefense headlines, and I think it comes from one of these institutions. But every week it's bird flu this, animal flu that, monkeypox, and I said recently, like turkeys. And last week, they just culled a whole bunch of turkeys. And if you sit back and think about it, there's no in Croatia they were killing a whole bunch of cows, I think, and pigs this summer. You realize that there's no reason to do that. It's a false pretext. Yeah. And then you see the principal consequence of all of this scaremongering is what's the outcome? It's a mass and vast culling of animals, and ergo that we eat meat protein, and I can't come to any other conclusion but that they wish to create artificial food scarcity in terms of meat and inflation, so it becomes more expensive for us plebes, where we'll have less access to energy, and it's almost like a mini version of in Ukraine's 1933 Holodomor. Any thoughts there?
I agree. I think it's. I mean, in UK back in 2001, when we had foot and mouth, funnily enough, one of the first 5 farms that declared a foot and mouth outbreak was one of my family's old family farms. So we've kind of watched that from the very beginning, and the whole policy was insane. You slaughtered 80 million animals because you didn't want to introduce a vaccine. They were saying that, if we introduce a vaccine, then we lose our foot and mouth free status, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff. But I do think they are driving prices up. I spent a lot of time in Canada this year, and the food prices are just insane. The price of meat is insane, and pricing a lot of people out of it. There's when we talk about culling animals, there's something that may go to the Canadian Supreme Court in the next week, and it's about an ostrich farm where they had bird flu positive tests 2 years ago, and the Food Standards Agency ordered the cull of this flock of 400 ostriches, and they've all recovered, and they're trying to to use the ostrich eggs to produce pharmaceutical, apparently. Some kind of a monoclonal from the eggs. And of course, the agenda that's coming from Moderna, who have a new factory opening in Canada, is that they want to vaccinate everything against bird flu. So the policy is just insane. It is absolutely insane.
No, it's obvious, and I just keep repeating every day. I think people and around me, people have to understand. I get angry, like with people around me. I'm saying, like, they're literally trying to kill us. Dan Dix of Press for Truth in Canada was talking about the MAID program, where they're just trying to get everyone to kill themselves in the UK. I've been listening to Lords, British politicians saying, these people, people who have autism or Down syndrome, we should assisted suicide. I was saying, what was it? I argued most politicians have. I'm using the phrase that the politician used, that they have these learning disabilities. So most politicians are eligible for assisted suicide. I'm arguing, but they're really like it, whether it's MAID or straight out just killing all of our food. Bringing in these digital controls, I feel like we're quickly moving toward that 20th century round of what R.J. Rummel called democide, where the governments are about to just mass kill us. And just to go back to what you were saying, what do you think are their agendas? So you're talking about vaccines, so markets. So obviously one of them is money, right? That's the obvious one. But I think there's much more beyond that, no? Because the other one is genetic manipulation. So I think they are working on stuff that they can use for genetic manipulation of their soldiers. But also some of the elites, I think, are thinking of trying to find ways to achieve immortality, no?
The genetic agenda is a really scary one. So I don't know if you've ever seen it's an Australian scientist who has a Substack blog and under a pseudonym because of his job. It's Dr. I Can See It. And he actually did a blast analysis of the genetic sequences in the Moderna and BioNTech COVID vaccine. And they have a small, what they call an SMP sequence, or PAM sequence, sorry. So in these big, long genetic sequences in the two vaccines, they have the same genetic tag in the exact same location. And this is a CRISPR gene editing tag, which, how does it happen to appear in the same thing? And when I was looking at some of the other vaccines that they've been trying to roll out or repurpose, one of the ones that keeps coming up is the smallpox vaccine. And it's the one that was developed in Germany in the 1970s. So the company that has the IP to it is Bavarian Nordic, and it's known as the Ankara it's MVA, but essentially it's a smallpox virus, and they talk about it having a big genetic payload. So they're inserting other things into it to deliver genetic material into people, and that just seems to me that there's more going on in the background than we're being led to believe. And there's a real fixation with trying to gene edit people, but not in any transparent way. So the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was another one that was actually a gene therapy originally. So there was a 18-year-old American who died in 1999 after he'd been given a gene therapy. He had a rare genetic disorder, and he was in the phase 1 safety trial. And that set back the whole gene therapy field for 20 years because they had to tighten up all the regulations. Well, it was the same chimpanzee adenovirus that was used for the gene therapy, delivered a different way. But that does seem to be what's driving a lot of this research into vaccines. It's how can we genetically manipulate this? So it's not just an immune response, it's about other gene editing, and that's quite nefarious.
Yeah, as you say, I'm trying to, I don't even, it's hard to fathom what exactly they are doing. But if I just really had to scratch my head and think, I just listed out a few things here. As you said, so this is a weapons platform. So what they're doing by gene editing us is, first of all, it's some sort of weapon that they're using on us, which is definitely not good. Another reason you should not get injected with anything. People talked about during COVID, when you look at GMOs and law, people have posited this sort of thing. If you get injected and genetically modified, then do they legally now own you? With GMOs and Monsanto and food, where they, farmers, they put deliberately on farmers who were organic farmers, they spread GMO seeds so then they can basically confiscate their farms or put them out of business. And then you have, of course, to make us sick. Maybe at some point they put enough of this stuff into us that they can disable any individual whenever they want. There's Gattaca. I often cite this Ethan Hawke, Gwyneth Paltrow movie, right? Which it's kind of like what Bukele's doing, where you're going to have a two-tier society: the organic humans and the transhuman biohacked, genetically modified humans, and the social credit system as well. I think this plays into the social credit system and maybe the Internet of Things. What they're trying to do is through this link us up. The Microsoft patent 666, where they link humans to cryptocurrencies to the cloud. But I also found in China during COVID that the mainstream articles from China where they ran, and they admitted the Chinese authorities effectively ran a false flag where they got people to give up their blood, do blood tests, and then that their blood was taken, that DNA, to do sort of like PCR tests, and then that was taken to in a government database so they can have your blood and DNA. So just any thoughts here on my little riff?
I agree. And there's a US Supreme Court judgment, and it's ostensibly about ownership of a laboratory cell line, human cell line. But I think it does create a future potential for somebody to take ownership of anybody who's had some of these vaccines. If you've got some of a company's genetic sequence that's integrated into your offspring's DNA, and it fits the bigger totalitarian agenda. So if you remember back in after 9/11, it wasn't just the PNAC full spectrum dominance stuff. There was another project, the Total Information Awareness Project,
which people say today is Palantir.
Yeah. And this fits that agenda, and the vaccine end of it is how you get the vaccine passports, all those restrictions that they were trialing during 2020. The old acronym COVID, Certificate of Vaccination ID, does seem like the most plausible origin of the acronym to me. So yes, I think there is a totalitarian agenda, and it's really very sinister. This is a global project, and it's been adopted by governments, and I think the WEF has played a role in kind of indoctrinating the political leadership around the world to buy into that agenda. And of course, that takes you back to the 60s and Kissinger and some of the more nefarious American government mind control programs. And where does that fit in? I think there's a lot more going on beneath the surface, and I share your concerns.
And the DNA aspect, if you think about it, it's like the final nail in the coffin of the control grid, because if you have CBDCs or PBDCs, so you got the digital currencies, you've got the digital identities, the digital wallets, travel wallets, and then they've got your the biometrics, and then finally your blood and DNA, that really cements all citizens into this control system, because they've got your DNA, which they can then use to track you, to trace you, and all that. And it really seems like that's the final cement in the coffin. And you mentioned WEF. I mean, again, my president, Claudia Sheinbaum, just a few weeks ago, had a big meeting with Mexican government officials and bigwigs, and for Larry Fink and BlackRock, he was there, and Borj Brende, who's now head of World Economic Forum. So it's like they have free reign. And that's just the most recent example I can think of, to your point, of WEF and governments. And just real quick on Mexico, if you want to just tell us more. I don't think we really got into that, of the 2009, your most recent article for Brownstone, the dry run lockdown. And I was a grad student at the Geneva School of Diplomacy at that time, 2008, 2009. And at that time, June of 2009, I was actually at the 62nd World Health Assembly. Let me, here it is. If I can pull it out real quick, just to show on screen. I haven't showed this very often. So I was a staff assistant for the Czech Republic. Here it is on screen. Let's see if I can Zoom. 2009 May, Mr. Moric, Czech Republic, World Health Organization. My pass to get in, and Margaret Chan was the director general. Like, she'd pass in front of me, and I was with the Czech Republic's mission to the, I think, UN. And there was no swine flu, but Mexico, I think, was used as one of the prime. So I came to Mexico the year after, 6 months later. So I didn't see any of that lockdown. Some of the people that I've asked here were younger folks, and they don't remember. So I got curious after your article. I'm going to ask some of the older folks if they remember what it was like back in 2009. But if you want to tell us about
Yeah, so that story. So I'd stumbled upon the Mexican lockdown because once I knew about it, and once I jogged my memory on it, it was like, oh yes, I remember the news stories back in 2009. But I was at a hearing here, a COVID inquiry hearing, and all the panel of experts were saying, oh, these lockdowns, they were unprecedented, and it's the same old story. I'm sitting in the audience thinking, no, they're not. I know one. And it's very recent. So that was why I decided to write that story. But looking at it, I think the agenda behind it was that GlaxoSmithKline had come up with a new pandemic flu vaccine that needed. So the idea behind the platforms back then was that you could just update the sequence. You authorized a vaccine, and then you could tweak it without testing it again, was the thinking behind it. But there were advanced purchase agreements with all kinds of governments for it. And they had a few other little things in the background that they were trying to fast track through the authorization process. And they needed to wrinkle more money out of Congress. And one of the things I picked up on years ago when I first got interested in the whole vaccine business was listening to Canada's first vaccine safety scientist, who was an Indian vet originally, named Dr. Shiv Chopra. And Shiv Chopra was one of the few vaccine safety scientists who wasn't trained by Johns Hopkins in the 1960s, because he'd come from India and then studied in the UK and then at McGill in Montreal. And he said he opposed the mass vaccination of children at the time. Because he felt they were going to cause autoimmune problems. So this mania for vaccines has come out of the pharmaceutical industry wanting another profit spinner, and it just happens that this is one of the things when they push them out through the emergency routes, you don't test as rigorously. And there was a lot of that going on. But Mexico in 2009, I think they were trying a few things. So the big agenda in the background was, how do we get an extra couple billion out of Congress? So we engineer an emergency. And the report that was done for the president, when you look through the back, Kadlec's not in there, but Callahan is, and Lawler, and Hatchett, and Nicole Lurie, who went on to be ASPR, and now is at CEPI with Hatchett. And it's like, oh, isn't it interesting? It's all these people again. And the idea of it was actually in the 2007 US influenza plan, because in the implementation plan, they referred to snow days. You might have to order people to stay at home, and snow days sound a lot, who doesn't like a snow day when you're a kid and you don't have to go to school? Stay home and stay safe. And it sounds a lot less sinister than a lockdown does, because that's prison terminology, which is interesting that became the dominant word in 2020. Planet prison. Mexico. Sorry, I go back to Shiv Chopra. He said at the time, have you ever noticed that whenever there's a disease, it's always brought by foreigners? So even the 2 children in the US that apparently were the first 2 cases in the US of swine flu were both Mexican American children. And then the attention shifted to Mexico. And and I think Chopra's point is actually very valid, because you'll notice it's always foreigners.
And, something just that you made me think, and I feel like I need to repeat this for people who aren't aware, but also for myself, so I don't forget. And I have it, most of this stuff on my Telegram channel, Geopolitics and Empire. If you type in the search results, you'll get the actual article. If it's disappeared, you can use archive.today or Internet Archive to get the original article. But I distinctly remember during the 2020 COVID operation, like in Mexico, what they attempted, and I think that connects to the 2009 episode where, in Mexico City, they tried to get everyone to use QR codes to access any establishment, scan before you go in, for shops, tienditas, pharmacies, banks, whatever. After a week, most people simply didn't comply. So Mexico City had to retract. The mayor was like, "Oh, okay, just kidding. Never mind. It's not work." But in other states, there was more success. Like Tlaxcala, which is a tiny state, is effectively run over by the WEF. It's just a 15-minute city. So the projects have 15-minute city projects are accelerating in places like Tlaxcala, Nuevo León, Sonora. The state, they just made a deal with Foxconn to make the capital a 15-minute city, and then replicate it to the rest of the state. And then here in Jalisco, where I am, they, you had to wear masks anywhere you entered. At some point, they wouldn't even let you enter unless they put gel on your hand gel. You couldn't work unless you were injected here in Mexico. And then you had things like they were trying to float. I have the articles where the governor of Jalisco said, we're considering altering the state constitution. I always joke, the motto of Jalisco is the free and sovereign state. Like, what a joke. And he's like, we want to change the state constitution of the free and sovereign state of Jalisco to be able to force inject you. That never came to pass, but they were floating these ideas. And then the other one was to enter the state of Jalisco from another Mexican state. These are internal Soviet-style passports. You would have to produce a vaccine certificate, which is, it's just total madness. And people can't forget these sorts of things. And then you had the amparo, the injunction, which the current government just weakened. So amparos are like the last Hail Mary defense citizens have in Mexico against different forms of tyranny. And in Mazatlan, the governor said you can't enter malls, banks, supermarkets without a COVID certificate. And some activists and lawyers started filing injunctions, 500 of them. So citizens got, hundreds of citizens got injunctions against this tyranny, and eventually the governor had to relent. And so I feel like there's a connection between 2009 and some of the stuff we saw here in Mexico.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think in 2009, the Mexicans were pushed into the lockdown by the US. And I think there were threats to close the border to American goods, or Mexican goods crossing the American border, which of course causes all kinds of problems. But the other interesting person who turns up quite prominently in 2009 is, of course, Augustin Carstens, who was the finance minister, who's now the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements. It's like, and of course, the agenda for the CBDCs is definitely coming from the central banks. So there we have, another of these same people turning up in.
Yeah, can we jump to that point then? Because I think if people realize by now that now they're pushing CBDCs, digital identity, like UK, you can't work without it now. Here in Mexico, it's funny the timing. They just announced simultaneously the biometric CURP. So now you have to get the biometric national ID in Mexico, or it's the digital ID in UK, or wherever, real ID in the US, or otherwise you can't do anything. And it's almost like there's no difference between the the digital passport of 2020 and the digital identity that they want now. And once you realize that, it's like clear that, well, 5 years ago they've been trying to do this with just different pretexts. It's medical situation, get the digital ID. Oh, it's migrants, get the digital ID. Oh, it's, I don't know, World War III, Ukraine, you need a digital ID. Get your DIA app in Ukraine. Yeah. So just
they've been trialing the biometric IDs with refugees from Syria. That's been ongoing since about 2016. One of my sisters is actually a Canadian Foreign Service officer, and she was working in Syria processing refugees at one point. So that digital identity agenda has certainly been used in that sphere for some time. And you're right, it comes up as the universal solution to everything. The only thing that gives me slight comfort is that, and I think it's actually linked to the real agenda behind climate change, which is to redirect power and water to the data centers. So if you follow commodities, one of the things that's happening now is that they're trying to develop small nuclear reactors to power these generators, so like mini nukes. So the whole basis of the uranium mining industry is changing, and it's no longer spot price based commodity. It's moving to term contracts, so there's certainty of supply for these power generation stations. But the data centers also use a lot of water, so they're redirecting water. We have hosepipe burns occasionally in the south of England, and that's where all the big data centers are. And really, because there's an danger of interruption to household supply, or is it more about ensuring that the data centers keep supply? I happened to see something a couple of weeks ago, and it was saying one of the problems with the data centers is that if you think how quickly your laptop needs to be replaced, or your phone, this is where the whole system breaks down, because they need to replace the equipment in the data centers. If you're having to replace everything every 3 years or 5 years, at some point that becomes, an unworkable business model. But that's certainly where they're trying to herd us all.
That's the white pill. A number of people bring this up. And I've been experiencing this. I'm on my third SSD drive in 4 years. And the problem was the first slot, the primary slot for my SSD, according to the motherboard, is right between the CPU and GPU, which get very hot because I'm rendering podcast videos, and that heat destroys the SSD. But even I've moved it to another location, which is fine now. But either way, it has I have external hard drives for backup, and they say the average life is 5 years, as you say, maybe 10 if you don't use it a lot. But I don't want to wait 10 years or more and find out that my data, pictures, the podcast backups and all that gets corrupted. So every 5 years I buy new external hard disks myself. And so it's not sustainable, is it?
Not at the moment. I had a conversation with somebody who was retired, but he had worked for IBM and wrote a lot of the mainframe software for Revenue Canada. And he was saying, the Americans keep trying to get me to go down there and be a consultant because the tax system, they don't have a unified tax system in the way that Canada does, because the states control some of it. It's not just a federal thing. And even from that perspective, he thinks they're decades away from actually being able to implement what they're trying to implement now. And he thinks that's another one of the big flaws in this, just from his experience on working on the Canadian one, which is apparently the biggest IBM mainframe in the world.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's interesting to see who you find in a small town pub.
and even here in Mexico, the tax system, SAT, is so inept and corrupt. Like the recent reports that they leak, they're not safe. The databases, people can find out how much you make, your addresses. There's hacks. It's absolutely insane. And then not to mention how corrupt they are. I mean, my wife had her identity stolen from the Mexican tax administration. She hasn't even been working for almost a decade, and they said that, in these certain years, you had this transfer of money, which wasn't even true. That's because what the companies reported that she received, but she didn't receive any of that she was working for 11 companies at the same time while she was in Kazakhstan living with me. It's kind of like what? And then you got to fight. You tell the tax people, like, does this make any sense? Can one person be working for 11 companies, not even living in Mexico for these Mexican companies? And then the tax agency is like, you still have to prove. Like, what planet are you on? And so,
funnily enough, I had the exact same experience back in about 2007 in the UK, and got my paycheck one day, and it was about £30. There was this huge amount missing. I said, what's going on? It literally was as little as £30. And it turned out that somebody had entered a Polish person who was working at care homes at the other end of the country into the system, and it had got attached to my tax account, and they were accusing me of undeclared income, and I hadn't paid enough tax on this. I don't know, it was about £30,000 in a part of the country that I'd never even stepped in. But it was a Kafkaesque nightmare trying to get them to fix it, because I rang up, and they take you through the identity checks, and there was something that I didn't realize that they had an address that was 2 addresses ago. And they would suddenly say, nope, you failed the identity check. Click. It's like, what? You can't just not talk to me. And I eventually went into the local tax office. I was quite distressed, and I was like, how do I fix this? They keep hanging up on me, telling me that they can't verify my identity. And that was how she took pity on me, and we kind of went back. No, it's not that address. What was your previous one? So it just shows you, if the system's not fit for purpose, you've got all kinds of problems. And that was just a small scale one that was fairly easy to fix.
Yeah, that's crazy. And yeah, I think I had a guest, Joe Allen, and he put it well. I think our biggest imminent threat might be just, he said it's going to be technocracy mixed with idiocracy. So you get, like, I often reference the 1985 movie Brazil. It's going to be Kafkaesque. So your experience, our experience here, I think there's just going to be a lot more of this sort of stuff. And what you mentioned about climate change, I've been talking about this for the last year or two. I'm like the only person I've heard bring up this thesis that you did, that climate changeism is it seems to be it's one of the main pretexts. I mean, it does many things. It's for world government. It's creating a global dystopia. It's a wealth transfer, but also it's a great pretext for transferring the main sources of energy, hydrocarbons, to the data centers and to the elite, where we get intermittent solar and wind. Even the Mexican freaking president Claudia Sheinbaum came out half a year ago saying, what did she say? She said something to the tune of, you're going to pay, she said something to the tune of, Mexicans are going to pay more for electricity or something like that. But what she meant was that the way that we're going to lower electricity usage from the main grid, which is related to hydrocarbons here in Mexico, is Mexicans, you are going to spend, of course, your own money to install solar panels on your homes. So you can use less of the hydrocarbon grid, which is going to go to the big businesses and data centers and whoever's got EVs. But you guys are going to get your electricity from solar. She literally said this. You can find in the archives her at a public. So I think that's what's going on there. And real quick, go ahead.
And even the solar agenda, silver is one of the essential components in those panels, and there's not enough silver mining capacity in the world. I mean, of course, that's big Mexican industry, but there are very few silver mining companies that can actually increase supply on demand. And you have this whole manipulation at the moment of the precious metals. 2 weeks ago, bunch of futures contracts drop on a Friday morning to try and knock the price down after it had been up over $50 an ounce for a while, because there's so much of it used in Tomahawk missiles. There's something like 250 grams of silver in every Tomahawk missile. It's a big problem. But if we go back to the climate change stuff, I did actually start writing a big series last year, and unfortunately my mother got sick, and I just wasn't able to finish it and need to go back and look. But I'd started taking a really close look at climate change. And of course, it's all Rockefeller Foundation. It goes back into mid-50s, and it was Lawrence Rockefeller who was the real architect of this little scam. But they set up the first carbon dioxide monitoring station in Hawaii, at the top of the biggest active volcano on the planet. And they said, oh, there's no industry here. And look, the carbon dioxide levels have gone up 7% in the last 4 years, or however long they'd been monitoring it. This is hydrocarbons that are driving carbon dioxide levels up. Nothing to do with the fact that volcanoes spew out carbon dioxide. And it does track quite nefariously into other Rockefeller-driven agendas in the background. And a lot of it from the early 1970s, because, of course, the person who was one of the co-founders of the WEF, it started with Kissinger's summer school in the 50s and 60s at Harvard. And then in the early 70s, you had Klaus Schwab, who had been Kissinger's student, and a Canadian political operative named Maurice Strong, who set the thing up as the European Management Forum, I think was its original name. But Strong and Gruhal and Brundtland, of course, were the architects of sustainable development. I don't know, have you ever come across Elaine Dewar's book, Cloak of Green?
No, I never heard of that.
It's fabulous. So she's an investigative reporter, Canadian, and in 1987, she got interested in why Brazilian Amazon Indians were being brought to Canada to talk about climate change. So she started investigating all the NGOs and ended up spending time in Geneva with Maurice Strong. She had some of the best interviews with him that were contemporaneous of when they were actually doing all this sustainable development stuff. And the vaccine agenda really has come out of Rockefeller Foundation as well. But the Sustainable Development Goals and the sort of Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 go back to the Earth Summit in Rio and the Summit of the Child. So 1990, 1992. And that's when a lot of this stuff got moving. So somebody like Bill Gates is a Johnny-come-lately to all of this, and he's really been fronting for the Rockefeller Foundation. But it all knits together.
Yeah, and it comes with the energy and health. Now they're merging together as a problem, One Health. And I do have the book. So it's Elaine Dewar, Cloak of Green, the links between key environmental groups, government, and big business. I've got the PDF on my desktop. One of my past podcast guests, it must have been a year ago, he sent it to me and said you should read it. So it's been sitting on my desktop. I need to read. I'm reading the book by the two guys out in the UK. What's it? The Hidden History World War. Maybe you know Gary Docherty and Jim McGregor. I bought the book 6 years ago, and I'm finally getting around to reading that one. So maybe I'll get the Cloak of Green after that. But you also wrote an article talking about your open letter to Trump. Don't be bamboozled by the dystopian Stargate project. And so, again, that's Larry Ellison, Oracle, data centers. What do you think? And, Operation Warp Speed, and it's like Operation Stargate is like Operation Warp Speed 2.0, kind of merging everything we've been talking about. It's like merging everything together: the genetic manipulation, mRNA, vaccines, data, mass data collection, AI, data centers. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think this is not the first time we've had this kind of great reset. If you go back to the Middle Ages and the dissolution of the feudal system, the monasteries in the UK, those are complete overhauls of the economic system and the economic order that people had grown accustomed to. So it's just accelerating. And I think part of the agenda, linking back to what they were doing with the sustainable development, is actually they're trying to make, it's based on the Convention of the Sea, and it's to make the global commons corporate property. So to protect the global commons, we have to restrict people from free access of them. So it has analogies in British history to the enclosure of the commons, but it's a digital system that's to protect it from us.
So effectively, they want to become, in the truest sense, up until now, this hasn't been possible, but the true masters of the universe, where they basically own the earth.
Yep.
Total insanity. But I don't know if they're, as we mentioned earlier, they'll be able to do that with having to replace the hard disks they're going to eventually maybe run out of silver and the minerals needed, because they're going to have to tokenize, right?
Yep.
Everything.
Yeah. And, can they do it right now? I mean, they just have to keep building data. I had one computer scientist that I knew who said, "Oh, we just have to build more data centers." But how many more data centers can you build? That's why, if you look at, I've been following the commodities. As an offshoot of looking at what they're doing with the CBDCs, and the fact that all the central banks are buying gold, and vast quantities of it. The Chinese are buying under-processed slag and shipping that back to China and refining it to obtain more silver, so it's not going through the exchange markets. But there's a very...
What do you think with gold? Because on the one hand, they're talking about CBDC and all that, and then the other, they're buying gold. Do you think that's kind of an insurance policy? If the digital stuff doesn't work, they'll go back to gold, or they have some other...
I think it tells you what real money is. And the real money is the gold and the silver, and to a lesser extent, platinum. When you start to follow the people that have been in this investment space for the last 40 years, there's an American investor named Rick Rule, you may have heard of. He's a big commodities investor, but he says, well, in the 70s, the American dollar inflated, lost 75% of its purchasing power. And that's what he thinks is going to happen over the next decade. So the CBDCs are to engineer a soft landing for the US debt problem, which is really the American bank problem, because they're sitting on a derivative time bomb. And all these agendas are just getting knit together. And unless you start to connect the dots, most people just don't see it. I've tried to explain it to my sisters, and they just look at you. It's like, you're nuts.
Nobody gets it. I've got silver round here from Mexican Libertad silver ounce, and I bought this one at 550 pesos, and last time I checked, it's now worth like 900 to 1,000 pesos. So there you go, double. My purchasing power, at least whatever I put into silver, has doubled. Is there anything, when it comes to the biodefense agenda, anything else that you think is important that we haven't touched on?
I think if they introduce these biometric IDs, these digital IDs, there will be more coercion for us to be taking more of them. And if your digital ID doesn't work unless you're up to date with whatever they want you to take, that's a real problem.
Do you think so I'm just wondering, and it's funny because back in the summer of 2019, I distinctly remember in the summer of 2019, I was in Croatia and I was talking to my cousin and my mother, and I had to come across that plan. The European Union official website, they had a plan to make like mandatory, introduce vaccine passports in the EU. And I was telling my cousin at the time, like, vaccines are bad. Look, it's all about control. And my mom and my cousin were kind of like poo-pooing me. And it's funny, he actually became he flipped 180. He became like one of the top Croatian dissident activists. He even got a fine from the government of Croatia in Zagreb on the main Trgur Plaza with the loudspeaker fighting against COVID-19 84. But do you think if they can bring in digital ID, that simply to travel, I don't know, for me, from Mexico to USA or to Europe, or for you to travel UK to Canada or USA, that they will require vaccines, and if you're not injected, you can't travel?
That's what Canada did. So during 2021 and 2022, to try and coerce people into uptake of the vaccine, there was a Canadian federal government travel mandate, and an unvaccinated person couldn't travel on a train or an airplane. So I had elderly parents who became unwell, and I couldn't travel from the UK back. Well, technically I could travel to Canada at a right of return, but I couldn't leave again.
So
they've already done that, and yeah, that is a real problem because the passport system already enables that. I saw something yesterday. Thailand is now adding vaccine history to their travel visa applications. So yeah, it's a real problem. And of course, that is Rockefeller Foundation as well. It was the Rockefeller Foundation who hijacked UNICEF in the 1980s. They installed one of their trustees as the head of UNICEF. And he was able to bully the WHO into adding the word universal before vaccination. So it was originally presented as a solution for the third world. And then all of a sudden, when you've got potential to spin more pharma profits out by vaccinating everybody needed it.
I mean, I think they're going to do it. You're right. I mean, they already did it during COVID. You couldn't travel. I mean, for the 2 years I couldn't travel because I'm not taking a PCR test ever. And to go to Croatia, you had to at least take a PCR test. And then they removed those restrictions in May of 2022. So you could fly without anything. I immediately bought tickets for the family to go for the summer to Croatia. But yeah, I think as you say, unfortunately, if we just extrapolate, we won't be able to fly again. Do you think there will be any loophole that us uninjected will be able to use to fly? Or maybe only by land, I guess, by car if you can travel, maybe across the board.
I think that's why it's so important to keep trying to expose what was done with the vaccines in 2020. And that's something I've spent a lot of time, and a lot of my writing is about researching the way that the UK were hijacked or complicit in this agenda to roll them out without proper testing. So I traced that little plot back to March of 2015. And it involves Dr. Kadlec again, because after the US gain of function moratorium in October 2014, within weeks, Kadlec saw this as a threat to his biodefense policy, and he was working as a consultant to various pharmaceutical interests, including Emergent Biosolutions, the manufacturer of the anthrax vaccine. And he had set up what he called the bipartisan blue ribbon panel on biodefense to review biodefense policy. And in March 2015, he and Hatchett organized a National Academy of Science meeting, and it was to discuss how are we going to make vaccines self-financing, the development self-financing, so we don't have to keep going back and asking Congress for new budget appropriations every time we have a new project. And that was when this Manhattan Project for Biodefense was cooked up. And the keynote speaker there was Farrar, who was the director of the Wellcome Trust at the time. You had somebody from EcoHealth Alliance. It was Peter Daszak. He's been banned from any US government funding because they were the ones that were farming out some of the work to Wuhan. I'm not sure if George Gao was there, but it was, and they had a panel on coronaviruses at this 2015 meeting. I mean, of all things, what a coincidence, because it's a common cold. I don't know I can't remember off the top of my head if Barrick was at that one, but that's where it started. So the planning's been going on for a while through the background. And of course, Kadlec, said at the beginning of the conversation, yesterday there was this congressional hearing, and he looks as if he's about to be confirmed as the Assistant Secretary for Cyber in the Department of War, which is really concerning because he'd introduced he's very effective at introducing or using executive orders and new legislation that actually make it easier to obtain things like emergency use authorization. So he was the person that before, it was in about 2018, there was a new law in the US where if you needed a medical countermeasure like a vaccine, the Department of Defense can effectively direct the FDA to authorize it. And that's what they did with the mRNA. Although they needed regulatory cover. So the MHRA authorized it first, but it was coordinated between the US and the FDA. The head of the UK Vaccine Task Force actually testified that Pfizer were required to submit the paperwork to the Pentagon first and then submit their dossier to the MHRA. And the big scheme at the end of it was to push the European Union into issuing a conditional marketing authorization that survived the emergency period. And Hatchett's vice chair was a Belgian scientist named Piet Piet, who was one of the people who discovered Ebola, allegedly, in the 1970s. I think it was a failed yellow fever vaccine. And when you look back at the records at the time, nobody thought it was a new virus except Walter Reed. And all of a sudden, it's this new scary virus, and it didn't appear again until 1996. But it's the same people, time and time again.
I mean, it's effectively, this is everything we're talking about can be encapsulated in it's a one big giant military operation directed at all of humanity by the global. It's the global government's military, DARPA, Pentagon, Department of Defense, NATO. I know you haven't talked about that, but there have been a few people in the past who linked NATO having a role as well in all of this. Of course, the European Union. I don't understand anyone who defends any of these agencies or institutions. I mean, these are all globalist, sinister globalist, anti-human agencies, supranational institutions who are out to get all of us. And I'd argue their Eastern counterparts, the BRICS countries, are towing the same line. No?
Yeah, I mean, NATO's an interesting one. I was looking at the government supplemental estimates for 2020, 2021 a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed that our Department of Defense in the UK had a contingent liability line item, and it said, well, the coronavirus was discovered in November 2019. And I thought, was it? How interesting. The Department of Defense is saying in its official sort of accounts that it was November 2019. So that suggests to me that Kadlec, because of course he was a career military officer, and he had activated something via NATO much earlier than the Chinese announcement on the 31st of December, because the Chinese apparently didn't know about it in November. But the UK Department of Defense did.
Yeah, and I've experienced it myself, that NATO often has been in the front lines of controlling the information space, often with their partner agencies in the US of DHS and CISA. That's why I was taken off of PayPal in 2022 and Patreon in 2021. And I've mentioned before the Associated Press did a hit piece on Francis Boyle, whose claim to fame during COVID was my interview with him that blew up in 2020. And that AP article was co-written by Atlantic Council NATO's think tank. And that same week or a week later, I was taken off of Patreon. So these are not democratic, freedom-loving institutions. And there are some people, I get irked. There are some of these anonymous X accounts that pretend to be my friends for a while, and then they flip and attack me. And you see them promoting as good guys, EU, NATO, Pentagon, and saying the bad guys are Russia and China. And I'm like,
Yeah.
What BS? They're all bad guys. Do you have any thought on Russia and China's roles? Because I don't see them. They're doing the same stuff. No.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with COVID, as part of the narrative to make medical countermeasures legal, you needed a foreign state actor to have done something wrong. So they didn't want China to have done anything intentionally wrong, but, they lack security. And funnily enough, in Elaine Duer's book, which she wrote in 1987, there's a mention in there that there was a US military lab in Wuchang, China. I was like, interesting. How far back? We're talking involvement between the US military and Chinese not bioweapons, but biodefense research going back that far. It's a little throwaway line, and I've not been able to run down anything else on it. It apparently came out in some kind of environmental assessment over a military site in Utah in the mid-80s. And there it is. There are about 9 of them, and there are far more of them now, something like 200 US satellite military research posts looking for viruses and health threats all around the world. So the Chinese, I mean, certainly the head of China CDC at the time, George Gao, did his PhD at Oxford, studied under Sir John Bell, who was one of the main people that I think were controlling the agenda in the UK. So I've kind of narrowed the list down to Bell, Farrar, Patrick Vallance, who was the chief government scientist, and there's another one. Well, Hatchett was in there because he was acting as a UK public official in an unpaid capacity. The Chinese, it was always clear to me that they weren't the drivers behind it, because they weren't the ones making all the money. It was all American pharmaceutical companies. So I was always perplexed by China's shutting down the global economy.
Right. And on that point, I mean, I think we have to clarify. It's not about saying, and I think this is a psyop that the Western Department of Defense runs. All these books and papers that came out saying it's the China virus. It's China launched this biological operation against the West, or the flip where they say the West launched a bioweapon against the East. I think neither of those are true. I think they're all in on it together. But as you say, if you follow the money and the technical know-how and supply chains and logistics, it seems to be emanating from the West, DARPA, UK, but China sort of played along, no?
Well, China played along. One of the BioNTech, because BioNTech actually had a different vaccine that they were developing for the Chinese market, and it didn't contain the American patent. So BioNTech's vaccine and Moderna's vaccine use the same NIH intellectual property under license, which is interesting that there's a Casper gene tag in both of them in the same location, isn't it? But BioNTech had segmented their global market, and the vaccine that they were developing for China was an RBD vaccine, and it turns out that the only RBD, so receptor binding domain, so it wasn't the full length spike that the genetic code was targeting, it was just the tip of it. But George Gao has a patent that a Chinese company developed for an RBD vaccine design. And Barney Graham at NIH, in one of the books about the COVID vaccines, because he was one of the scientists, government scientists, who made a lot of money out of COVID. But he talks about, well, the RBD was, that was George Gao's design. And the Americans didn't buy anything in Operation Warp Speed that didn't have NIH IP in it, because one of the ideas behind it was to generate this income stream through intellectual property to finance the next magic potion that they want to roll out for whatever synthetic vaccine that they dream up. So I think one of the big problems is actually the Bayh-Dole Act, and the fact that, to me, it's institutional corruption, because these scientists now have a vested interest in rolling out things that are going to give them a much more generous annual income than the government pension. When they license that same full-length stabilized spike protein 27 times or something, so if it's 150 grand a year for each commercial product, every time it's licensed, that adds up to millions.
Yeah, and just to comment previously what you said, again, I would urge folks to, if they haven't, check out in my archives my interview with Igor Shepard, who was discussing the working together between East and West on these things behind the scenes. And Event 201, I believe, had also not just the U.S., I think CDC representatives and the CIA.
Gao was there.
Right, the Chinese CDC.
Yep.
And speaking of CDC, I just found it hilarious. Maybe you saw the news recently. Australia is, I thought they already had a CDC. Apparently they didn't. They had like an interim sort of CDC for a year. And now they are officially, the health minister of Australia unveiled the Australian Center for Disease Control. I call it the Center for Democide Control, but the acronym is going to be ACDC, and ACDC is from Australia. And it's just kind of ridiculous. But I mean, that's sad news. And maybe I get your thought here real quick. Some U.S. states, I think this is an important point. Some U.S. states like California, I think Washington, Oregon, maybe, and another, because of the current CDC and RFK Jr. being there, they're not, these liberal globalist states in the U.S. are not, they said they're not going to take orders from the CDC, or at least when it comes to vaccine recommendations, and that they're doubling down on increasing in their states. So they said, we're not going to listen to CDC, we're going to do our own thing. And I think this is bad, because this means in those states, they're going to increase vaccine requirements and propaganda, no?
Yeah, and of course, the federal government in the US claims the right to be involved in vaccines under the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. So it's for the regulation of trade, because health is supposed to be a state responsibility. And it's because it's always been, vaccines have always been a US military project. And that goes back to George Washington, who was the first person to order American military personnel to be vaccinated against smallpox, because they lost their first battle, the Battle of Quebec, which was one of the early imperialist agendas. And it was because the troops were self-variolating, because they'd heard that there was a smallpox outbreak in the area. So they got sick, and the response was, well, we're going to mandate it. So that's where the military involvement is. And yeah, I mean, I think you're right. NATO was heavily involved in this. Well, I mean, Russia's fallen out with everybody, haven't they? But they had their own vaccine. Everybody's made a little bit of money somewhere along the way, and everybody was just acting in lockstep. There's no real opposition. everybody was on board with the same agenda. And is that because they've all been indoctrinated by WEF involvement, or where has that come from? But there's really no plurality in political agendas anymore. It's all very much aligned down the same.
That's the $1 million question. Where is that coming from? People have pointed out the penetration in Russia. You've had the Herman Graf, the cyber polygon, through Herman Graf, globalist. A lot of the Russian, Dmitry Kirilev, I think is his recent name, the guy that proposed the link between Russia and U.S. I mean, you look at their pedigrees, young, global, tied to WEF, studied at Harvard, Yale. Even recently, New York Times reported how a lot of the CCP heads were rinsed through Yale, Harvard. That tells you something. Convergence, right? I had a great guest on years ago, Emmanuel Pastrik. He did a great essay. It's on his website. I thought it was masterful, where he kind of tied these threads together, where he said basically you had these like boutique IT companies and private financial capital and these are also like military intelligence that were working in all of these countries, driving all of this globally, handing out the policies to the Chinese governments, the Mexicans, the EU, the US to carry out. Like you've got behind the scenes these McKinsey consulting companies, UN agencies, the BlackRocks, the Rockefeller. I live in a 15-minute city. I've said this ad nauseum and I was shocked to discover who's financing the green agenda where I live, and it's the Rockefeller Foundation. So they're giving money to my local government and giving them the technical know-how to implement it. So I think that's...
Well, I think it was a Danish journalist who did a really interesting series on World Wildlife Fund. And he was looking at Africa, and essentially all these areas that are targeted for being nature reserves are all the kind of interesting strategic areas. And when you start to map them all out and look at the background of the WEF, not WEF, WWF.
But all of this is one big WWF, World Wrestling Federation, and it goes back to just what you said, that they're attempting to become the masters of the planet and take full total information awareness, full spectrum dominance, control. And maybe just a quick question on vaccines. You wrote recently, trust no one, the doctor's warning to mothers to be over vaccines. I'm a parent, and our last kid was, none of our kids are injected. Particularly our last kid was born in the room next door, the most wonderful, quickest birth ever. Did not even give the kid neither vitamin K shot nor whatever liquid they put in their eyelids. And the kid is perfect, couldn't be better. Why would I inject them? I just have no faith whatsoever. And these companies are criminal. When I look at the old RFK Jr., and him and others who had court cases against these pharmaceutical companies where it was proven that they are murderers, that they knowingly gave all sorts of their drugs and pharmaceuticals that killed people. So they affect, and this is in the court of law. They've killed people, and they just got a slap on the wrist. They paid a fine. Why would I inject myself? For anyone who's still listening, who thinks I'm some conspiracy theorist, these same companies knowingly killed you with their pharmaceuticals. Why would I inject myself with some mysterious liquid from them?
Going back to the 1980s and the Rockefeller childhood immunization agenda, because the Rockefellers in about 1978 were arguing that bringing the developing world up to Western standards of sanitation and clean water was unaffordable and unrealistic, because we had this global financial crisis, the OPEC oil crisis and the fallout from that. And vaccines were part of the alternative. Oh, we've got this cheap cheap solution. We just go in and this is what should become primary health care, is giving these children vaccines. And in the early 70s, there was an Greek-Australian doctor who had been asked to investigate why the number of infant deaths had doubled in some Aborigine communities in a single year. And his name was Archie Kalakarinas. He died in about 2010. And when he went in and looked, he said, I realized it was the vaccines. They'd started rolling out the vaccination program. And because these children were malnourished, they were at higher risk of harm. So 1 in 2 children was either killed or vaccine injured in these communities when he went in to do his study. And in 1988, UNICEF had a consultant who wrote a paper when they were looking at expanding the what they were calling the child survival revolution. It's so Orwellian. Reminds me of the British minister in 2005 who said about digital ID back then that 1984 was a warning, not a roadmap. But what they did in 88, so this consultant for UNICEF is saying, well, with this child survival revolution, we've got to target premature babies and malnourished children. And I find it hard to believe it's anything other than malign, because you're targeting the people that it's already been shown are the most likely to die or be injured.
I mean, I just go back to think, and I come from a biblical worldview, and this idea of like grit, we come from the dust, we're made of dust from the earth. And every time I go to my grandparents' village in the middle of nowhere in Croatia, and my father always reminds us, when you enter the village, before you enter the village, the preceding village, there's a barn on the side of the road where my grandma was born, in a barn. No vaccines. Just, people are born in open fields, in barns, and nothing for thousands of years of human history. Like, do you think God created us that we're going to need injections? No, You just pop out and you're good to go. And it's just
by design.
It's madness. But so many people are brainwashed. Most of the normies, wherever you are, me here in Mexico, they inject their children nonstop, and it's just, it's just crazy.
Well, there'd already been an atmosphere created in probably the 20 years before COVID, where it was already a very polarizing issue. You couldn't have a conversation in polite company about vaccines because people were tied to one side or the other, and there was just nothing in between. And I have friends that blazing rows with about vaccines, and they got a COVID vaccine injected and then regretted it. But somehow in their minds, the problem is just with those vaccines, and all the other ones are okay.
Yeah, I had friends, and this was before COVID, and we were talking vaccines, and it's a religion too, this cult of the vaccine. Someone pointed out recently in the meme, like, you have faith in the vaccines, and some friends didn't want to talk to us anymore because they were in the cult of the vaccine, whereas I'm happy to be friends with you and congregate with you.
Now, were those American friends?
One was
Croatian friends.
European. It was a mix. European, Mexican. Also, happens. I think it's across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, I found with a foot on either side of the Atlantic myself as well. It's not been such a problem in the UK, but in Canada, the indoctrination is really just so deep. Some of my oldest friends and I can no longer communicate.
I mean, and that's the craziest thing. I'm happy if you're anti. I say, they use this as a weapon, anti-vaxxer. I'm a no-vaxxer. How about that? I got you there. I'm a no-vaxxer, and but I'm happy to be friends with anyone. If you're a pro-vaxxer, anti-no, why can't we all just set aside some differences and come together? I mean, it's really telling that you usually it's the liberal globalists, as I call them, who are the ones like don't have that love. Like, oh, I don't want to hang out with you. So
yeah, no, it's all very, very sinister. And once you start to see the connections between all the various agendas, and very often it is the Rockefeller Foundation that you can trace it back to. And certainly that's where Maurice Strong had his connections to. And it's we're in a very dangerous place.
Yeah, and I'll since you mentioned Rockefeller a number of times, I just thought of my recent past guest, Jacob Nordengard, and I read his book, Rockefeller, I think, Controlling the Game. It's really a good book because I think he agrees with you. It's largely, of course, there are other actors, but Rockefeller seems to be the biggest, and it was one of the best books tracing, one interpretation of tracing this path towards world government and control. And any final thoughts for us on, as you said, we just have to keep speaking out, but anything else that can be done to resist this tyranny? And I often think also that, if they do advance, it's a twofold question, like how do we fight against it, stop it, push it back, but also how do we survive it, if they push through?
I mean, one of the things, I spend a lot of time actually still on the vaccines and the way that they were pushed through to get because I think the rollout and the basis for there's so much fraud, the legally unsound authorizations, and the legal relationships are all in the contracts, and you can't escape. It's in black and white once you start to connect the dots there as well. And I think that's going to be one of the really important things to attack. So it does concern me a lot that Mr. Kadlec, or Dr. Kadlec, is now back, or likely to back. I did check before we came on this call to see whether he had actually been confirmed, and the vote hasn't happened yet. But that's a really bad development because he's a very effective operator. And I think he's a corrupt operator too. So I don't know whose agenda he's ultimately serving.
Comes to mind is that song by Zishade, Smooth Operator. Great song, but any other thought besides what do we do? Resistance?
Well, resist digital ID at all costs. That's the tough one, and I think that you're right. The passports are, because what they saw last time was that a lot of people caved because they wanted to go on holiday after so long. I mean, I think that on a positive note, I don't think they'd get compliance again if they try lockdowns, because a lot of people, certainly in the UK, people woke up as soon as the Prime Minister was having parties and suitcases of wine delivered every Friday afternoon when the rest of us were supposed to be locked up in our houses. All the credibility for that's gone. But it was worrying listening to the panel of experts that I heard 3 weeks ago, who were all talking about, there was just so much uncertainty and we need to prepare for the next one. And it's all just so pious. It's as if these professors just have lost their ability to think critically about what's happened. There's still, I just find it incredible that so few people have actually questioned what happened. And does this make sense? Because if you step back and look at it, it just doesn't. It doesn't stack up. So it's really worrying that I think that genuinely bought into the narrative, and they just seem to be blinkered and unable to get out of that groupthink.
Yeah,
even if they personally didn't agree with lockdowns.
Yeah, and these people you mentioned, I mean, I have complete disgust pretty much for virtually at this point all politicians everywhere. And as you mentioned, they're either the you know, as Jesus, it was in the Bible, the love of money is the root of all evil. So these people are in it for their love of money and accumulating like to no end. Like I don't, even if I had more money than I do now, like I have a house, I have everything I need. Like more money would I wouldn't be happier at all if I got more money. But also the cowardice, the coward. What really gets me, whether it's from the people you just referenced who don't even want to question, or the political functionaries who are just cowards. I think of recently we had the 7th Mexican mayor assassinated at a public Day of the Dead event last weekend. And this was a man I think is a hero. He said he's a father. It was a father, and he says, "I'm not going to." He was not afraid of the cartels, and he was calling out the narco government. And he died. And I'm like, if we had a critical mass of people like that, they can't kill us all. We would get to a point where we would overrun the system. We just need enough. It's like D-Day, designated day, Normandy, right? Where when they landed on the beaches, and they knew a bunch of them were going to be cannon fodder. But but after that cannon fodder got taken out, they were able to advance and win. And so that effectively, I think that's the strategy. Some of us, we need to get more people putting their heads up above the parapet. I think that's the only way we win. And so,
because as everything I see tells me that full spectrum dominance thing that Cheney and that gang kicked off, that's still a going concern. It has not gone away. They're not using the same technology or the same terminology anymore. So if you're not paying attention, you don't see it. But it's there, and it's been embedded in all these institutions. You know, they actually pulled or they set up a NATO headquarters in the US.
Well, what do you know? What's going on?
I think their operational headquarters have always been in Norway, if I'm not mistaken. And it was in 2019, which seems to me to be something to do with the hostilities with Russia, which were just starting to gear up. But they actually made an announcement that they were setting up, another alternative operational headquarter in the US. And that's the first time that's happened. So that seemed to be a worrying development. It's a while since I looked at it, so I don't remember all the ins and outs of it. But
I had a past guest, Bruce Gagnon, who pointed out besides him, I've seen this in some globalist writings in the past, that NATO, he thinks that, UN at this stage isn't fit for purpose, or that the West can't get complete control because they always get vetoes from Russia or China, and that NATO might become the true world government organization. And I've seen articles talking about how they would rename it to New Alliance Treaty Organization, and they want to expand NATO to create a global NATO where they incorporate all of the world's countries into NATO. And so again, it is a sinister, evil, satanic world government institution. It's not.
And really, the war in Yugoslavia is when NATO's the shift came, because it was no longer a defensive organization; it was being used offensively.
Yeah, and I see this as a Croat when they offensively targeted 99, right? Serbia, and they even bombed the Chinese embassy in
Yeah.
Belgrade.
And
And,
the
and I
television
always,
headquarters as well.
yeah, and
In
I say this is a rock behind. It's a rock. They always put us in between a rock and a hard place where you have the documentary Weight of Chains. There's other Andrija Klaric, a Croatian podcaster. He recently gave an interview. He said, the plans for war in Yugoslavia. There's documents to show there was planned 7 to 8 years before the collapse of Yugoslavia, and then you had the IMF and World Bank, and so the war could have been planned or involvement formed from the Anglo-American establishment in the EU, but not to mention the organic developments as well. So it's always a complicated a mixture. But was my point here saying that? So yeah, it's like they maybe helped get the war started, and it was going on. Serbs crossing into our Croatian territory, and then NATO with Operation Storm helping us end the war. So it's kind of like it's like a Faustian bargain. Like these same people who are involved in starting it, they help us end it. But it's kind of like it kind of.
Yeah.
What do you?
Isn't it interesting that Tudjman was at Kissinger's summer school?
You sent me that a while ago, this article, and I was shocked, I think, to learn that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that predates when he was imprisoned by Tito, but it maybe partially explains the reason behind that, because he possibly didn't trust him by then. He would have had to have had official permission to go, I think. But yeah, very interesting that.
We'll have to do a separate episode on Yugoslavia and the Balkans. But where are the best? Your links are in the description, but you're on X. Yeah. Where's the best place for people to find you?
The most complete archive is at Conservative Woman, and there's a link on the front page. So yeah, I'll get to the climate change stuff because there's so much there as well, and it's.
I'll link your archive to Conservative Women and Brownstone in the podcast description. But thanks for coming on the podcast, Paula.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It was nice to talk to you.